And this was in relation to Max Verstappen and kicking a journalist out of the press conference. We had an awful lot of reaction to this. And this example for here from Florence McLean: "You have the right to ask. Good. He has the right not to answer and ask you to leave. The British press is biased and only looking at asking controversial questions." There were several other comments. There's one here: "Deadlifting is life. Don't ask questions to get bad reactions out of drivers." Oni Chauvet: "In my opinion, a driver can refuse to answer a question, but they cannot kick a journalist out of a press conference." JH at the end says, "Of course he can. It was his press meeting, not an official FIA press meeting." This was a tip of the comment iceberg of this, Ben, and there were a lot of reactions. And the one I wanted to focus on was a constant thing I see online in particular about a bias of British press. Now, I'm going to be upfront to say we're both British, but GP Blog is not a British site. It's a Dutch site, ironically, which may be surprising to some. But what I wanted to say is I feel there's this perception in the sport and among the fandom that there's a bias with British press. But my argument would be there's an overabundance of British press in comparison to a lot of the other nationalities. Plus, there's the problem which Sky Sports, the UK Sky Sports, has long had, in that it was, in this case, the default provider for the worldwide feed, which then means you're not British, but you're hearing British people talk. Whereas I've watched Italian coverage of a Formula One race before, and oh my God, if you want to talk about bias, the Ferrari, this was when Ferrari were like P6, and there was nothing but Ferrari that I saw. So I feel that there's this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that the British press will look biased because there's a lot of British press that will inevitably have a focus on getting the British drivers in their headlines, in their focus, as I said. What can you tell us about your insight with this? You've been in the press and in the paddock, and you've seen the amount of press that there are and how much are British and how much are not. Is my theory holding up a little bit?
Look, I mean, I think we also need to remember that F1 is based in London. I think the majority of F1 teams are based in the UK, in England. I think the majority of the paddock, something as much as 80%, is probably British. Maybe 75 to 80% is British. In terms of media, the majority of that press centre are British. I think that the other thing is the actual, if you dial into that media landscape of those British writers in that press room, historically, let's go that way first, the majority of those were not only British, but they were working for British newspapers. And that automatically marks you down as a slightly different journalist to someone that's freelance, in the sense that the way that you approach your interview technique and subject is that you're representing a British outlet, and so that your focus is going to be a British driver and trying to get answers from the British drivers, because that is what you're working for, your core market. So, when you hear those press conference interviews, and the drivers must also see it as well. They see, all the questions going to Lando or Lewis or even Ollie Behrman or, whoever, or George Russell or whoever the British driver is. And they think, oh gosh, they're getting all the questions. I'm not getting asked anything. There's definitely a bias here. And maybe there's like a focus, but I don't think it's a bias in terms of positivity, because those journalists that represent those newspapers back in the past had a responsibility to hold people to account. So and I remember writing this, many times when a British driver had mucked up, you would always criticise them. So it was on reflection. It was fair. You supported them when they did well. And then obviously when they did something wrong, you would obviously jump on them and say, look, this was not right. So I think it was always kind of an approach that was fair. But I can understand why people thought it was biased, just because of the way that you're working for. In the same way that if you're working for a Dutch outlet, you're only going to be focusing predominantly on the Dutch racing driver, as in Max Verstappen. And you see that now in the press centre. So you see the way that the handful of Dutch reporters that are there are very much jumping on everything that Max does and says. And so you could accuse them of being biased just because they're focusing so much on one particular driver. So but there's only a small number of the Dutch journalists, in the same way that there's now fewer Italian journalists, and there's definitely fewer French and fewer German. So, you don't get that overriding sense of bias like you do with the Brits, who outweigh the number of other different nationalities in that press room. So it's kind of a skewed media landscape, if you like. The other element, which I'm going to get back to, is the freelance journalist, the one that's afraid of asking awkward, uncomfortable questions, who sits at the back and doesn't ask anything, literally just records all the audio quotes and then writes their story. That there's hell of a lot of that now in Formula One, where people are too afraid of asking the uncomfortable questions, which is probably why the majority of them do come from British media, because they're employed by outlets rather than being self-employed. So you're not so worried about upsetting the driver through fear of being banned or kicked out of a session, because you know that you've got, you hope, the support of the newspaper behind you, and it's kind of like you're working for an organisation to ask those awkward questions. Do you understand what I mean? It's kind of you're being paid to ask that awkward question. That's why you're there. Whereas the freelance reporter may be a bit more hesitant to do so through fear of, I can't upset this driver or this team because they'll never give me an interview again, and therefore I won't be able to go to work and I won't be able to pay my bills, etc., etc. So it's a slightly different mentality between a staff reporter and a freelance reporter. So it's quite a intricate landscape, the media landscape.
I don't think I would ever imagine Pierre Gasly or Esteban Ocon, unless they become world champion, being on the back page or the front page of a newspaper in the UK, because that won't sell. That is the sort of thing that you would definitely see when it's going to be a French outlet. But because of the nature of English being the default language, so to speak, especially in F1 and the global community at large, if there is questions in French, just to stay away from bias on other sides of things, that people can't keep, not everybody can speak French, so it's completely over the heads of a lot of people, whereas English being able to be spoken by the vast majority of people who are in the paddock and watching the sports and able to understand it, even if it's through subtitles or whatever, that they are getting British questions predominantly, like you say, and those are, I think, a really good point what you just said. Those are coming from the people who are staff writers rather than freelancers. Hopefully give you a little bit of insight, anybody who's watching and listening. Let us know what you think below. So if you have any other talking points you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, please do comment. You can like and subscribe while you're there. But for now, we have been F1 Paddock Update. Goodbye.